2,000 years they governed their own lands, living in the coasts at the southernmost part of Africa. They had kingdoms that broke apart and re-emerged almost independently. They had no contact or little contact with foreigners, and when the contact happened, it seemed to have bared little to no resemblance in the culture that you see. The culture would then grow and become contacted and fully whole with other cultures around, including Muslims and Christians. These 2,000 years would be buried in the sand, buried in the ocean, and buried all around the world until people started looking. The earliest pottery of this region goes back to before the structures are found in this region, and so it is known that these structures came from these same people. But let's refresh our memory by playing this 30-second video of what I'm talking about.
As the diver approaches the rocks, he knows there is something different about this reef. That's because it's not a reef at all. He realizes he may just have stumbled across the remains of a long-lost city, and he is swimming around its 4-kilometre wall. Academics believe this may be what's left of the near 2,000-year-old city of Rapta.
It's important to understand that these were coastal cities, but more important than that is the fact that these cities seem to be laying on islands, which is why they keep getting swallowed by the oceans. Now, another thing to recognize is that this island, which they say is 4 kilometers long, the stone wall that surrounds this area, is only a piece of a giant city. This is something that I failed to show in the previous video. It is not the entire covering of the city, but only a small area which probably belonged to someone very important in order for it to be this structured. The island in question today is called Mafia Island. And of course, the question would be, why would anybody pick this island over any other island around the areas? Well, it seems like it's not the only island that they chose. But even given that, look at it. It's a virtual paradise. These people, while other people in the Middle East and North Africa were living in total war, these people were living in virtual paradise, given that their only enemies would be some tribal people who had lived as hunter gatherers forever. And it seems those people were integrated into the civilization. And of course, if you're a nation of sailors, you're going to need boats. These boats would come with sails, and they would come with several other inventions that were independently discovered by these people, and they used to get to places as far as Madagascar. The Mafia Island area in which they were in was a center, but it was not their end. This end is unknown because, of course, these people keep going underwater and being swallowed, and their history with it. A trend you will find is that whenever there is any form of civilization in this area, it is easily and almost always thrown to the Persians as the founders of those regions. One of the reasons is because it is so far back that the Arabs are not exactly collected as a people, and so they have to throw a completely different group and they say it's Zoroasters, which is why we have to be careful the fact that the people who founded this Madagascan civilization might be the exact same people who founded the civilization of Rapta, which now has been 100% removed from any foreign power and has been proven to be independent based on pottery and stuff like that that's been found in those regions, dating before and after the site was up. Now, the site did collapse before the Muslim age. Which brings me to this powerful image. It looks like nothing, just a typical picture from Africa. Some mountain in the back and a bunch of people standing in the front. These three people, two of them are tourists, one of them is a scholar, the female, is a hill. This hill is not just any hill. This hill, described by Azalea Huo, is actually a man-made hill. This man-made hill has been created over 2,000 years. I'm going to say that again. This hill over here that looks like it's natural is not natural. It's on a beach, and it is one hill that has been created over 2,000 years, showing the people who lived in this area. Well, what is it? What exactly is this hill? Well, it's shells. The people of this region, including the Raptans, seem to have been embracing everything about the oceans. And one of the things that they embraced was mollusks. To avoid copyright, I will simply read the subtitles in the still frames, but I will link the video in. These are shells. We all know what shells are. Because these shells mostly carried clams and oysters, after taking the mollusks out of the shells, they lay down. It means that several people were doing the same activity. You will hear somewhere saying the dump of shellfish shells. They are talking about this dump. It's important to point out that it is a layer of the shell mountain with special emphasis on the glass beads, are similar to those found in Manyikeni. They were also found in South Africa. They were found in Kenya, Madagascar, Tanzania, a little bit all over Africa. But also were found in India, the Middle East. We are talking about Asia. We are talking about China, which somehow makes this commercial link with Mozambique. In addition, most of the evidence that was found here in this mountain of shells was also found in Zimbabwe. An important point, which is that these shells represent a big, big trade route thing. It may look like a mountain, but as the presenter says, you can see that close up it is a dump, and it's a dump of shells. Now remember, a lot of these people from this side of Africa and all around the coasts used shells for money. They used it for food. Oysters were food in this region, sort of going against the original porridge type foods that a lot of the inland people eat. These people are eating fishy foods for a long, long time. So long that they create this mountain, which is 3 meters high. So if we start from the year 0 AD and then we travel all the way to 500 AD, what we'll see is that these shells are already accumulating. So from 0 AD to 500 AD, they're accumulating. But not only are they accumulating, they're marking various markers about these people's travels, because here found are glass beads coming from as far as Indonesia, India, China, and also in the European regions. This shows that this place was not isolated, at least not in 0 to 500 years. Why is that important? Well, it's important because this 0 to 500 years, which marks the start of this specific region for these people, sets a trend of a non-foreign entity, meaning they are non-foreign. They are not an entity that comes from some other place. They are not a group of people that can be summed up by, oh, they are influenced mainly by the Muslims, because the Muslims didn't exist at this time. You can't even say that, oh, they're influenced by the Arabs, because the Arabs had barely even touched this region. You can't say they're mainly influenced by Europeans, because, as you can see, the Europeans only grazed this area in terms of trade. And even there, the trade was rhino horn and things of that area. The name Azania would be used to denote this region to give it a pathway. But not only was it given a pathway, it was described as a place where people sailed from here to other places, other lands. And we know from previous writings that people as far away as Dachin, meaning the Roman areas and also other Western worlds, would sail as far as Indonesia. This Indonesian trip would be closed down when the Muslims finally took over. But before we get to the Muslims taking over, let's talk about how these people created such a great empire in a time where some people call this world the Dark Ages. So the Dark Ages does mark a dark age in Europe, but instead of being a dark age for the rest of the world from 500 to about the 1500s, it marks a light age for most of the world. So let's count prior to the Dark Age and get our way into the Dark Age. 100 AD, we find already made civilizations in this region, and perhaps there are others which have disappeared over the years. 200 AD, we know that there is at least one mission to the coasts of Asia by these people traveling back and forth, following the wind. We know that these winds that they used did not just serve them, but also served the traders from those regions. So prior to Islam, we know that some Arabs met these people halfway, perhaps trading with Ethiopians first before arriving in these regions. The winds, described by some pre Arab and post Arab people, are so harsh in some of those areas that some people did not dare to travel through, which makes it curious because we find beads from Persia, China, and India in that region. It also means that these people had a direct access to Indonesia, being the guys who called the people from Indonesia to that area. Perhaps the Indonesians just had a feeling that they should go to that region. But given the fact that the people in that region started copying the cultures of the Bantu people, I feel that it's quite fake to say that those people must have had no clue about who was in those areas. And of course, they arrive at about the same time that you see this civilization. AD 0. 200 AD still marks something even stranger than that, which is the fact that we know these people came from deep Africa. What brought them to these coasts? So, what it marks is the first time where we see more people coming from the inland regions coming in and disturbing the civilizations that are found in that region, adding to an already Bantu region more Bantu people. Places like Dar es Salaam would go from slightly populated to overpopulated in no time. These people would fight wars amongst each other, as we see over and over again. These people are always ready. Bantu people in these regions, they have spears, swords, all kinds of weapons, which show that they are not the most peaceful people that you could find. But yet we find nobody talking about them fighting anybody outside of themselves. And even within themselves, they seem to have worked swimmingly with each other. Now, 300 AD, we must remember now, we're still talking prior to the Muslims even becoming a thing. So their expansion to these regions is not very known and not very well documented. The expansion of the Arabs to this region, not the Muslims. Now, later, Christianity would come to these regions, but 300 AD is not that date. Christianity is sort of stuck in Ethiopia, destroying the theory that it was the Ethiopians who created the Raptan civilization instead of it being people who were, in their words, heathens, or people who represented the religion of the Africans at the time. When the Muslims got there, they talked about how even as far as Kilwa, meaning an area very close to the Arabic regions, even there, the people before the Muslims came were heathens, meaning they did not have the religion that the Muslims or Christians preferred, instead worshipping their own gods, the ancestors. And again, the people of Ethiopia were already Christians by this time. 400 AD, a push into Ethiopia is seen. These people are no longer happy with just the domain they have. We see wars starting to break off in the corners of Ethiopia. But as described by one of the people, Al-Masudi, who described this in 800 AD, so he wasn't around during this time, there is a great river and there is great land that stands in between the Ethiopians and the Zanj, which means that these people could barely go there. Al Masudi also adds that that is a good thing that there is such a distance between these two people because the people of the Zanj, meaning these regions, all the way up till you get to Kenya, are so numerous and they're so brave that there is no way the people of Ethiopia could be able to stop them. Now, keep in mind, these people of Ethiopia have already taken over Arabia before. They've already taken over parts of Sudan. So, for Al Masudi to say that these people's bravery is beyond that of those people, it tells you what type of people you're dealing with. And their numbers means that there were more and more and more Bantu people coming into that region. We know also that people like the Maasai also came into those regions, Nilotics and people like that, which means that this place was quite stuffed. Now let's read Wikipedia for 1 second because I want you to understand the similarities. And I love that they put the monsoon of South Asia there. But I want to talk about this trade that must have happened. But I also want to talk about the fact that they will get some things right and some things wrong simply because it is underestimated the power of these people. So let's start with the map that they show. So if we look at this map, right, you can see that the trade routes aren't directly from one place to another. So you can see there, the purple shows back and forth between the islands of Zanzibar. This would be the Raptor regions, and it would also be Chibwenu, the place where that island of, or that hill of shells is. So in those islands, we know that those people definitely were trading, at least in the first century, with these people. Now we can see there that the monsoons are pushing back and forth with the Comoros Islands, and you can see that they put a whole thing which shows that these people had a direct trade with Indonesia. If we look at the red, we can see a completely different type of trade. This red shows that the people of East Africa and the people of India, the people of Arabia, and all those were trading in an independent trade from that of the Zanj people. Now, this is an important thing. I'm not saying it's completely accurate, but it's an important thing because it shows that they didn't really rely on the same things that the Zanj people were relying on. And if you can see the green that shows the limitations of the people in Africa, you can see that from the green, which is one of the least studied parts, that's why there's question marks, it leads into the purple and goes directly to Indonesia. We do not know how exactly these people must have made their way to Indonesia. We don't know if they took the route first to India via Sri Lanka and then went all the way down, or if they just went directly there, the same way that the people of Madagascar would have gone. If you notice, though, the Zanzibar Islands, the green, look at the green arrows. If you notice, they're so close to Madagascar that it's impossible to assume that these people were two completely different groups. So now we can read. Trade along the southeastern African coast started as early as the 1st century CE. Bantu farmers, who are considered the initial settlers within that region, built communities along the coasts. These farmers eventually started trading with traders from Southeast Asia, Southern Arabia, and sometimes Rome and Greece. So let's pause for a second. Keep that in mind. 1st century AD, these people are trading with all these different people, including Rome and Greece. Like I said, this part of it is no longer controversial. It's just a known thing. The Raptor site is known, everybody's known, and the only thing that's a little bit controversial is if these people were traveling all the way to Indonesia by themselves, why don't we find more evidence of Indonesian trade with them back and forth? And it might be because the Indonesians and the Africans themselves represent a grouping or a trade that was used by some kind of middleman. Perhaps they sailed close to Indonesia and landed somewhere in Asia, and then they would get some of the trade goods from there and then sailed back. But the answer is we don't know. So this next part that I'm about to read is after the 500 years that I was talking about. That first 500 years marking a pure African with no other person coming in and staying for a long period of time. So you see trade with other people, but no real influence. And of course, you find those walls, which again, they are part of a larger civilization, which according to the Roman writers, the Roman and Greek writers, goes all the way close to places like Chad, if you accept what they're saying, which means it's a city that is huge, but there's other cities that are dotted all the way up until you get to Ethiopia. But this ends, and we know that later we will see that this will continue in terms of power, but it will not be one civilization under one king. The rise of the Swahili coast city states can be largely attributed to the region's expansive participation in a trade network that spanned the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean trade network has been linked to that of the Silk Road, with many destinations being linked through trade. It has been claimed that the Indian Ocean trade network actually connected more people than the Silk Road. Very important. The Swahili coast largely exported raw products like timber, ivory, animal skin, spices, and gold. Now we need to pause here because largely is a very important word here. They did largely export that, but there was a minority of stuff they exported, including clothing, probably ideas as well, and other things that to this day we still don't know how some things that we find being similar between Indonesia and Africa, some of the music styles and stuff, we don't know if it's coincidence or if one influenced the other. Then, of course, we find that a lot of the clothing is very similar, with the exception of Indonesia growing a very deep Muslim style of clothing, and of course India, because Indians took over a lot of the Indonesian areas, which is why the word Indonesia is in the name. But of course, the thing that is probably the most important is gold. Gold being exported means that these people will become extremely rich. Not rich, extremely rich. Two areas are working together. Now, the Swahili areas I used to think was because they're somewhat in the coast. Really, these people are islanders, but these islanders are being supplied by people more inland, people living in the Great Zimbabwe areas, people living in the Mozambique areas, in the Manyikeni areas, in the Kilwa areas, all the way up to the civilization that I showed you, the Dombashaba and all these people located even in Congo. Those people are bringing in items which you can't just get out of an island. They're bringing them to the islands. The people are coming to the islands and not understanding where exactly these people are getting what they're getting. And only later do the people start to investigate. And when they do, they find an aggressive people who have already become rich and have fortified themselves and made sure that no one can take over. And no one did up until the Portuguese completely, took over that region. But that was way, way later, somewhere in the 1800s. Now, the next part is also important. Finished products were imported from as far as East Asia. Very important part. Finished products were imported from as far as East Asia, such as silk, porcelain from China, spices and cotton from India, and black pepper from Sri Lanka. though these people were pretty much already living in luxury, living on islands, and also their culture being changing from a one of survival to one of pure luxury, the luxury, the area, the time for luxury just got more and more, taking some of the best ideas from around the world. And remember, the Swahili coast, we start noticing books in those regions. So even the smaller ideas, or at least the ideas that wouldn't be considered easy to trade from a people that were largely illiterate, we find more and more things coming in. So, what else do they bring? Some of the other imports received from Asia and Europe include cottons, silks, woolens, glass and stone beads, metal wire, jewelry, sandalwood, cosmetics, fragrances, coal, rice, spices, coffee, tea, and other foods, and flavoring, iron and brass fitting, sailcloth, pottery, porcelain, silver, brass, glass, paper, paints, ink, carved wood, books, very important, carved chests, arms, ammunition, gunpowder, swords, daggers, gold, silver, brass, bronze, religious specialists, and craftsmen. We continue to read. Other places that traded with the Swahili coast include Egypt, Greece, Rome, Assyria, Sumeria, Phoenicia, Arabia, Somalia, and Persia. Trade in the region decreased during the Pax Mongolica due to the overland trade being cheaper during that period. However, trade by ships provided the advantage that the goods that were transported on them were in bulk, meaning they could be available to the mass market. Many different ethnic groups were involved in the Indian Ocean trade networks. However, especially in the western parts of the Indian Ocean, Swahili coast being included, Muslim merchants dominated trade due to their ability to fund the construction of vessels. The yearly monsoon winds carried ships from the Swahili coast to the eastern Indian Ocean and back. These yearly winds were the catalyst for trade in the region as they reduced the risk associated with sailing and made it predictable. The monsoon winds were less strong and reliable as one traveled further south along Africa's coast, resulting in settlements being smaller and less frequent towards the south. Trade was further encouraged by the invention of lateen sails, which allowed merchants to travel apart from the monsoon winds. Evidence for Indian Ocean trade includes the presence of potsherds on coastal archaeological sites that can be traced back to China and India. This is what we're talking about. This is the biggest, or probably the least known area in the world that is probably the biggest, most important connection between the worlds, but is ignored for obvious reasons. China. The route from China to the coast of Africa is not a very easy one. And so when the Chinese finally made their way down there, it is interesting to know that they already had a name for them. They had been communicating with these people for a while, and they had a direct communication and a direct sail route from there to China, so from the Swahili coast to China. But how is this possible if for Chinese it wasn't that simple to sail to these areas? In fact, we know that the Chinese sort of saw it as a highlight of their time when Zheng He sailed to the coast, meaning that the Chinese didn't tend to sail to those regions, or at least they never did until later. How did Chinese items get there, and how did they know who was bringing the items? They already had the word Azania, meaning they knew exactly who the people were. They did not say these are items that we get from some middleman like Middle Easterners or Indians, but instead they say Azanians. This is proof that the people themselves, the Africans, would sail to, as they said, the east side of India, land on the east side of India, go to places as far as China and trade heavily, and then return as the winds returned. India. Now, before I talk about the influence of the Indians going back years and years, let's first talk about India in the sense that it influenced this place so much that they had mass exportation, meaning they would bring thousands of ships, and then those ships would travel with the winds, and then they would travel back with the other way. And remember Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama said that there were Indians in that region who started hitting their bombards. They were Christians, and they started hitting their firepower when they saw the Portuguese Christians, because they recognized the cross and knew that they were looking at something that was non-Muslim and was in that region being completely Muslim, or even worse for them, heathens, as they would say. Vasco da Gama describes the ships being filled with gold, also describes them as large vessels that would travel back and forth between these coasts, and that the only way that he made it to India without getting killed by a lot of these other people who really wanted him, who tried to trap him. The Swahilians tried to trap him, the Ethiopians were going to trap him, the Middle Easterners were going to trap him, the Moors were going to trap him. Everybody was trying to get him, but because of these people in the Swahili coast and the Christian Indians, they got him all the way there and all the way back. This proves that the motion or the movement into the region, it wasn't that these people were stuck in this area. It wasn't that they were sitting in this area and items would just pour to them. They were fully aware of civilizations that were outside of their regions, at least by the time of the Swahili era. Now, this brings up a separate question, which is how long ago did they travel as far as China? Did they travel as soon as they were there, like 2,000 years ago? Or is this something that happened way later? Whatever answer you come to, we still come to a very strong problem, actually. The problem being, who built this wall, right? It's the Africans, we know this. Who inspired them to build this wall? Well, if nobody traveled to those regions, then nobody. Why is it so big, and why does it almost represent nothing that you would see later on? Perhaps they became more efficient and understood that building super mega structures, just like how tanks used to be super huge in the past, and then now in our future they're as effective, just not as big. Yemen. Yemen is one of the places that would be the stronger partners of the Zanj, of the Swahili coast. Why? Well, there's a couple reasons. It's very close to the Swahili coast. Sailing there, you don't need no monsoons. In fact, you can actually get there by traveling on boat to Ethiopia and then walking the rest of the distance all the way down to the Swahili coast. The people of Yemen had many names for this area, and not only that, there are people, Muslim scholars, who wrote about several wars or several battles fought between some parts of Yemen against some people of the Zanj. This is not the Zanj rebellion. This is a completely different battle in which the people of the Swahili coast fight against some Ethiopians and some Yemenites. The people of Yemen also represent something different, which is a tight trade, meaning a middleman trade. The people of Swahili trade with the people of Yemen, and the people of Yemen take these things anywhere, even as far as Russia. Madagascar and Indonesia. Probably the most curious one of all. Not only does it represent a simple slide into Southeast Asia, but a possible connection with the Americas. If this connection is true, that will rewrite history forever. The thing that we notice though is that the people of Indonesia and almost all of their traditions disappear in Madagascar, replaced almost entirely with a Bantu style religion and Bantu style culture. Only later would the Muslims and so many other groups influence them, including Indians, but at the time the Bantus seem to have overwhelmed the Indonesians. It used to be thought that the Madagascans, located very close to Africa, were a group that was just abandoned there. So they just traveled through the islands. We don't know how they did it. They probably were island hopping or whatever, and then they landed there. Now it's pretty obvious that these people were probably traders and trade families that at one point were like, okay, instead of trading with these people, why don't we just go live close to that region? But it's not only the Swahili coast and it's not only the Madagascans and Indonesians that seem to take this travel thing seriously, because China starts to travel more. We start seeing more and more writings about Japan, more and more writings about other places, even Southeast Asia. And even if that chart is correct, we see the Polynesians being mentioned by the Chinese. What we are surprised by is that the Polynesians themselves start spreading at this very time. Who sparked them to do this? Was it the Indonesians? Did they just come up with the idea by themselves? Why is it that the entire world at this time has this giant Silk Road and then the Polynesians just start moving out of nowhere, creating a form of writing and then also reaching the Americas later on, earlier than anybody else, especially South America? Over the last 10 years, the Indian Ocean has burped out a lot of good answers that we thought were previously unanswerable. And more potsherds are coming out every single day. And like I showed you with that hill, that shell hill, we've got tons of stuff that we can look through. So what will happen in the next 10 years? What will be revealed? Are we going to be surprised by what happens next? If we find even one body found in the old world in the Americas, not only would it show that we're talking about a bigger network, the Silk Road being a much bigger network than we once thought, but perhaps even more important and more in need of study than any other event that has happened in history. And I want to remind you, remember when people were saying the Vikings were these great explorers? The Vikings, they went everywhere. They traveled here, there, and everywhere. The Vikings were nothing compared to any of these tribes that I'm talking about. They did not travel as far, they were not as ambitious, and they did not control their territories for as long as these people did. They were also not as technologically proficient and they were not as technologically sound as these people. But not only that, these people did not abandon their religions, as we still know their religions are practiced in these areas today.